Okay, so we'll just give folks a minute to file in, and then I'll make some announcements, and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Greetings, everyone. My name is Rachel Hasna, and I am with the University of New Mexico's Division for Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to our Law and Mental Health Didactic. A couple of quick announcements regarding our CEU process. In the last 5 minutes of the lecture, we will submit a link to an evaluation in the chat. If you just toggle your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat icon. Click on the chat icon, and that'll bring up your chat box. And that's where you can find the link. Click on it, fill out the evaluation, and a certificate of completion is automatically generated for you. It's your responsibility to save it. We do not email copies. So if you're on your smartphone completing the evaluation, you'll just want to take a screenshot of the document. If you're on your computer, you can save it as a Word or a PDF. If you scroll down to the bottom right of the screen, you're also able to email yourself a copy. We will be sharing the link, the recording link, as well as the slides. I'll be sending that out the end of this week or beginning of next week. And just a reminder for folks that we should be CME live next week, hopefully. So for those folks who have been requesting CMEs, we should be able to provide those by next lecture. And I'll hand it over to Julie.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome everybody to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you all here to join us today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. So for next week, we have Dr. Yossi Ben-Porath, who is presenting an MMPI-3 overview for forensic psychologists. So make sure you come with questions. Next for our talk today, please ask your questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable, but just know we're probably not going to get to them till the end. As always, we try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Please forgive us if we don't get to yours. For those of you who want the CEUs but are on a tight schedule, just know you have to stay for that full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. So we'll definitely let you know when that hour has passed. But again, we'll likely be staying on longer to take more questions. Let's see. I think that's everything for announcements. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Kimberly Brown. Dr. Brown is a licensed clinical psychologist and is board certified in forensic psychology. She is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry and director of the Vanderbilt Forensic Evaluation Team, which provides court-ordered criminal, adult, and juvenile forensic evaluations. She's experienced in conducting various types of forensic assessments in both criminal and civil settings. Dr. Brown supervises and trains psychiatry residents, psychology pre-doctoral interns, and psychology post-doctoral fellows in conducting forensic evaluations and evaluating and treating individuals with severe mental illness. She also teaches seminars and lectures that pertain to issues of forensic psychology in the Vanderbilt University Medical School and Vanderbilt Law School. Dr. Brown, we're so grateful to have you here today and for sharing your time and expertise with us. On behalf of the University of New Mexico, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. And a big thanks to the University of New Mexico for hosting this event. I have been a regular participant and I can share that this has been really a bright spot and something to look forward to during the pandemic. And I'm so pleased that this series is going to continue. I'm excited to present to you today an insanity defense typology. So I have no financial relationship to this program. The views expressed are my own and not those of the University of New Mexico. So please don't sue them. Don't sue me either, by the way, just to get that straight. Here are our learning objectives for today. The first is to describe a benefit of using the insanity defense typology and conducting insanity evaluations. Know or be able to identify some of the clinical and offense characteristics of the types that I'm going to present in this typology, and be able to identify the most frequent subtype in the typology based on research. So the content of today's talk is as follows. I'm going to introduce some background, talk about how I was inspired to create this typology for insanity defense evaluations, discuss the development of the typology, go through each of the 7 subtypes of the typology, breaking it down to defendant characteristics, offense characteristics, and then some case examples. And then I'm going to present to you some preliminary research that we have done on the typology, discuss conclusions, limitations, and then open it up for questions. So as way of background, there are a lot of great sources of information in the literature and research regarding insanity defense evaluations, in particular, guidelines for how to conduct these evaluations, what sources of information to consider in doing these evaluations, how to structure the report and interview, what to consider as the definitions of insanity defenses in different states. So there's the Apple Insanity Defense Guidelines revised in 2014, Rogers and Schumann's classic book in its 2nd edition. Patty Zapp has a chapter in Randiato and Irv Weiner's Handbook of Forensic Psychology. Ira Packer has a great series in the Best Practices in Forensic Mental Health on insanity defense evaluations, or MSO evaluations. And of course, we have the psychological evaluations for the courts, which has a chapter addressing the insanity defense. We call this the Slobogan book if you're from Vanderbilt, because Chris Slobogan is here at Vanderbilt. So we have all this great information about how to structure insanity defense evaluations, but it seems like there isn't a whole lot about what the typical insanity defense evaluation looks like, or what are the typical characteristics and defining features of bona fide insanity defense cases. So I like to use this image as an example of what I think is happening in the field and what I thought was missing. So it's as if you have a builder who has all the tools to build a house, but isn't told what the final design of the house is. So he has his lumber, he has his saw there, he has his hammer, but he doesn't know what the house is supposed to look like. So you can imagine that if your version of the final product is this cute little red and blue house at the top, but his version is the shack at the bottom, you may be getting very different products. And so I felt like this was the case as well with the insanity defense literature, that we had a lot of information on what the tools are, what the materials are that you may need, but there weren't a whole lot of clear pictures on what the ultimate outcome should look like in an insanity defense evaluation. So this in part inspired my work in developing an insanity defense typology. So the first goal or inspiration for the typology was to have a picture, to have the picture of the house to help guide training, to help be able to educate other people how to do these types of evaluations who are starting off. The other goal or inspiration was that maybe if we had a typology that provided a little more structure, a little more guidelines and clear examples, maybe we could increase the reliability of evaluators' opinions. And so inter-rater agreement has been a concern in insanity defense evaluations. Some of the work by Gowan-Smith and Guarnera and Murray raised concerns about the variability in insanity defense opinions. Also, Gardner and colleagues in their 2018 Law and Human Behavior article raised some concerns about the varying base rates in insanity evaluations in Virginia, with those base rates ranging from 0% for some evaluators to 50% for other evaluators. So there's really a great range there, with the overall base rate being about 17% across all evaluators. Further inspiration was I hoped that maybe by developing a typology and having a more structured data collection method, we could potentially reduce bias. So there's been a lot of research and literature in the last several years about bias in forensic evaluations. So Neal and Brodsky wrote about bias in a more general sense in forensic evaluations and talked about how these different factors like not liking the defendant, feeling angry about the nature of the offense, or on the other side of the coin, being too empathic could impact the objectivity in doing an evaluation. Neal in 2018 spoke more specifically about bias in insanity evaluations involving capital cases and proposed some potential correlates to bias, such as writing a very short report, maybe indicative of potential bias, or using very emotionally charged or exaggerated language, not incorporating much information, and having varying base rates, like we saw in the previous research, as potential correlates. Also, Warren et al. Looked at a large sample of insanity defense evaluations and indicated that there potentially could be racial bias in insanity defense opinions, in that they found that more white defendants had support for an insanity defense than Black defendants with similar circumstances. So potentially reducing bias, increasing reliability, and having a training tool were the inspirations, as well as to generate research about the typology, about the types, and see about agreement in rating cases with the typology. So the typology that I'm going to present was developed from about 2,500 court-ordered insanity defense evaluations in a large metropolitan area over a 17+ year period. The typology, as you'll see, contains separate defendant and offense-related information. And it's been used to train a variety of trainees across the years in psychiatry, psychology, law, as well as attorneys. And this has been published in 2018. It was published in Behavioral Sciences and the Law, and it's titled The Insanity Defense Typology. So this is available to review. So before I get into the typologies, I just want to go over some limitations and assumptions that are really important to keep in mind. The first is that what I'm going to present is data limited to one jurisdiction, the area that I practice, which is in Tennessee. And we have the cognitive prong of the insanity defense. So we're asked to evaluate whether the defendant, because of a severe mental illness, was unable to appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of their conduct at the time of the alleged offenses. So we do not have a voluntary, irresistible impulse prong in our insanity defense definition. We only have a cognitive prong. So this typology is based only on the cognitive prong, sort of a modified McNaughton definition. Also, in our insanity defense in Tennessee, which may be the same as in the state that you practice, voluntary intoxication is excluded as the basis for an insanity defense. So in these cases that I'm going to be presenting to you, the symptoms at the time of the crime were not due to voluntary intoxication. Also, malingering has to be ruled out in advance. The typology cannot help you decide whether a defendant is exaggerating or feigning symptoms. That has to be decided apart from the typology. Finally, this is not exhaustive or meant to be comprehensive. So there no doubt are other subtypes that could be added to the typology. So I just want to be real careful to point out that if you're evaluating a case and the defendant or the defense characteristics or offense characteristics don't seem to match one of the types in the insanity typology, that certainly doesn't mean that they don't meet criteria for an insanity offense. There's probably many other types available, and these are just some that I'm proposing. And as a limitation, the research on this is really limited. I'm going to be presenting a research study that was just accepted for publication. I'll be including that site at the end, but other than that, there really is no research on this typology. Okay, so these are the subtypes in the typology, and there are 7, and I'll be going through each of these. And just to point out, from the original 2018 paper, there's actually an additional subtype added. So number 2, paranoid protection of others, is not in the original paper, but we added it when we were doing some research because it became clear that this was another prominent subtype that I didn't appreciate initially. So there are now 7. Okay, so what I'll be doing is I'll be going through each type. I'll be talking about defendant characteristics, followed by offense characteristics, and then I'll be giving a case example to hopefully bring it to light and paint a picture of the house that I'm hoping to portray. Okay, so the paranoid protection of self. I'll explain this later, but this is the most common subtype in the typology. So if you're going to see any type the most, it's going to be this one. So here are some of the defendant characteristics. Persecutory delusions are one of the prominent symptoms with this subtype. So the individual at the time of the crime perceives that somebody is directly threatening to harm them. They might perceive that they're poisoning them, that they're shooting laser beams into their eyes, that they're sexually assaulting them when they're sleeping. And of course, these beliefs are rooted in a persecutory delusion. They're not actually happening, but the person perceives them to be quite real. They perceive the harm often to be imminent. And it's important to note, you don't have to evaluate whether realistically the harm is imminent. It's in this person's mind, in their irrational ways of perceiving the world, that they perceive their safety and often their lives to be an imminent risk of harm. Many of these defendants have taken steps to get help, and sometimes they've done lots of things to get help. They've gone to local law enforcement. They've even tried to contact the FBI to report what they believe is happening to them. They booby-trap their home, so they might set up ways that they can detect if someone's entering their home by putting string across the threshold of the door, for example, or taping the windows and seeing if the tape is broken. Some defendants will actually purchase devices that unfortunately are sold on the internet to block some of the electromagnetic rays or other things that they think are causing harm to themselves. They may try to flee their homes. Some of the defendants move and are traveling really across the country trying to avoid the harm. So a lot of times they've taken steps to get help. This isn't the first thing that they've done. Their criminal behavior is typically out of fear that they are going to be harmed or have been harmed. Now, sometimes they perceive that law enforcement who come in contact with them are a continued source of harm, and so they're quite paranoid when arresting officers show up. But this is not always the case. And I should point out that you don't have to have all these characteristics to meet criteria for this subtype. That's actually something that we're doing research on now. So if the defendant's versions of events were true, this might look like a self-defense under the law, but instead it's a self-defense rooted in delusional beliefs. So those are the defendant characteristics. Here are the offense characteristics. This is often a violent crime. So typically we're talking about assault or aggravated assault. Many times when the law enforcement comes into contact with the defendant, they acknowledge their actions. They readily report what they've been doing. They don't try to hide it. In fact, they continue to describe the harm that they perceive is happening to them. They'll tell the officers, well, they're poisoning my food. They're controlling this microchip in my head. So they often are not evading or running away or concealing of evidence in their case. So here's a case example. This is a 58-year-old woman. She has a very long-standing history of schizophrenia. She's been hospitalized several times, typically because she becomes very paranoid about what she thinks her neighbors are doing to her. She believes they're harassing and torturing her. In particular, she developed persecutory delusions that the neighbors had a machine that was sending electromagnetic rays into her home through her walls, and that it was causing her significant physical harm, that it was searing her skin, that it was causing her to hear voices, that it was causing her to have various somatic problems. She believed it had killed her dog. And she, up until the time of the crime, perceived that the electromagnetic rays were increasing in frequency and that the harm she was experiencing was getting worse and worse. She had taken many steps to try to help herself. She had told her husband, she had told her psychiatrist, she had gone to law enforcement. She even tried leaving the homes at times to try to get away from this. But in the end, she remained in her home where she thought this was continuing to happen. The day of the crime, she felt that it was unbearable, that she could not escape the rays and that they were going to kill her. So what did she do? She got a gun and she shot it in the direction of the neighbors. She didn't actually shoot at the neighbors, but she shot at their direction. And so she was charged with reckless endangerment. And she called these warning shots to get them to turn the machine off that was causing the rays that were harming her. Now, when police showed up, she readily admitted to shooting. She said, I had to do it to try to get them to stop. And then she asked police, can you please locate the machine that's causing the rays to come into my home, believing that they would help her and being quite surprised that she was being arrested and taken to jail. Okay, so that's paranoid self-defense type. Again, that is going to be the most common type in the typology that is developed. So the second type, this is the newly developed type that was not in the original article, is the paranoid protection of others. So in this type, again, persecutory delusions are the most prominent symptom. However, the difference is that the individual perceives that somebody else is in danger. It's not them that's in danger, it's somebody else. In this type, there's often the theme that they have to protect women and children. You'll see in our research for defendants who met this subtype, in our sample, all of them were men. Certainly, I can see case examples in which this could apply to female defendants. But in our sample, it was all men who believed that they had to protect women and children who were at risk of being harmed. And oftentimes the harm is not toward a specific individual, but a group of people like children at large. So one common theme here is that the defendant believes that someone is a child molester and is actively sexually abusing children and believes that they have to do something to prevent that individual from continuing to abuse children. The persecutory delusions directly cause the criminal behavior, so the defendant is acting out of the conviction that these other people will be harmed. If the defendant's version of events were true, the defendant would look like a hero. In other words, it would look like they were saving someone, that they were a hero. But of course, it's rooted in delusions. So in terms of the offense characteristic, just like paranoid protection of self, the offense is often violent in nature. The defendant often acknowledges when their actions when arrested and continues to report the harm. Thank goodness you're here. This man is a child molester. I held him down for you to arrest. And then they're surprised when they're the ones who are actually being arrested. They often don't run away. They, like I said, seek assistance from authorities. Sometimes they even believe that they're working in conjunction with law enforcement. So they might have the delusional belief that they themselves are an FBI agent and that they're helping law enforcement detect and capture these bad people. So I have two examples of this type. The first is I'll call Beyonce's protector. So this individual has a psychotic disorder diagnosis, schizophrenia, prominent delusions of actually various types. He believes he's a famous rap artist, President Obama pardoned him, paranoid delusions, neighbors are spying on him, he's disorganized, suspicious. So his crime involves his neighbor went out to get the mail, and he approached the neighbor at the mailbox and hit him with a tire iron, beat him with a tire iron. And he had the belief that this neighbor was a known killer, that he had killed several women, and that he was abusing Beyonce, who he had kidnapped and had in his home. And this particular individual felt like he was Beyonce's protector. So he did not perceive he did anything wrong. He thought that he was saving Beyonce. Who doesn't want to save Beyonce? And so he was somewhat surprised that he was the one in trouble with the law. Here's another type. This is someone who believed they were saving a famous musician. We see this somewhat frequently in Music City, America, here in Nashville. This particular person became convinced, by the way, I should say that these case examples are based on real cases, but I've altered the facts so that they will not be exactly the same as the real cases and not identifiable. This person became convinced that a famous musician was being held in a house against her will and was in danger. And so he initially knocked on the door. And by the way, the reason he knew that she was at this house is because there was a special green light on at this house. And that green light let him know that she was there. So he had an idea of reference regarding that. When they didn't answer the door, he barged into the house. He forced down the door. And he told the resident there that he was there to save his wife, this famous musician, and that he had every right to search the residence. The victim stated that he said this. So of course the homeowner calls the police. And what does our defendant do? Well, he stands by and he awaits the police coming. Why? Because he wants to make sure there's no one being kidnapped or held against their will. So the officers come and he readily says, I'm here to protect so-and-so, and directs the police to do a thorough search of the home as if he's the one in command of this operation. The police, of course, don't find anyone. And his explanation is, well, you didn't do a thorough enough search, right? So the delusions just kind of self-perpetuate. He is charged with aggravated burglary. And during the forensic evaluation, one of the things he said was, I did the most reasonable thing I felt to do. So in all these cases in which I'm presenting these case examples, it was our opinion that the defendant met criteria for an insanity defense based on not being able to appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions because of their mental illness. Okay, moving on to But It's Mine. This is a person who has psychotic symptoms that lead them to believe that they own something that they don't really own. So they may perceive that a house belongs to them or a car belongs to them. And oftentimes they have grandiose delusions, believing that things have been left to them, God's left it to them, or they won it in a lottery. Somehow it's been bequeathed to them. Now, there's an alternative form of this in which the defendant believes that they're paranoid that people are following them or trying to harm them, and they believe that this home or house or building is a safe location that has been left to them to seek safety. So there's sort of another version of that. Many times these individuals, in addition to psychotic symptoms, have manic episodes. So they might have a bipolar disorder with psychotic features or a schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. So what do their offense characteristics look like? Well, they're often nonviolent. So most of the time, people under this subtype are charged with trespassing or burglary. And typically no one is harmed. There's no violence, no one's threatened. The kind of the common scenario here is the homeowner comes home, sees unknown individuals sitting in their recliner, wearing their bathrobe, eating their Cheerios, with seemingly unconcerned that they don't belong there. And not really surprised that the homeowner shows up either, interestingly. So they perceive that the homeowner is actually the one who shouldn't be there. They have the right to be there. The homeowner shouldn't be there. And they may be surprised when asked to leave. And there's often no other crime committed other than they're just in a place that they're not supposed to be in. So as a case example, this is an older gentleman who is homeless, unemployed, with little to no social support or family. And unfortunately, those last few descriptors apply to most of our cases, and I'm sure yours as well. He has a long history of alcohol abuse. He's got several public intoxication and DUI charges. He's had a history of seizures since childhood. He had a head injury with a craniotomy, which resulted in nursing home care. So some of you are seeing this as a guy with really significant neurocognitive problems. 2 years before his arrest, he presented to a hospital with a delusional belief that he was a drill sergeant in the Army and was taking his soldiers to the gas chamber for insubordination. He also reported that he had $3 million in the bank and owned a home, although all the other evidence indicated that he was in fact homeless. So this individual was diagnosed with a major neurocognitive disorder. He had really profound cognitive deficits. He was very confused in the jail. His charge involved his entering a home. It was actually an Airbnb home that was not occupied at the time. And neighbors noticed him going into the home and called police. Police came, and when they arrived, he actually invited them in, offered them coffee, just like it was his own home. And when the officers arrested him, he asked if they were going to be bringing him back to the home. So he really didn't appreciate that being at the home was wrong or considered a crime. He was charged with aggravated burglary. Interesting, this person never became competent. He was found to be unrestorable. So he was not able to go on and take an insanity defense because he was never competent to do so. And his charges were dismissed. Okay, the next few types are less common, less represented in our research, but I'll kind of go through and talk about them briefly. So the erotomanic stalking, oftentimes they're diagnosed with a delusional disorder, erotomanic type. So they have the belief, the delusional belief, that they have a special relationship, a romantic relationship with an individual, oftentimes a famous individual. And they believe that this other individual, the victim, wants to be in a relationship with them, that this is reciprocal. And they often have a lot of ideas or delusions of reference. So they misperceive things in the environment to be signs indicating that they should be together with the victim, that they're meant to be together, they have a special relationship. So in terms of the characteristics of this subtype, there's often just numerous contacts with the victim, excessive numbers of phone calls, letters. These individuals, they probably should have second careers as criminal investigators because they're really, really good at getting personal information about pretty famous people. I really don't know how they find out where these people live and what their phone numbers are, but they do. And they abuse that knowledge by calling a lot of times. They're often really surprised by law enforcement. So when law enforcement confront them, they think that there's been some mistake. No. So-and-so, you know, that's my girlfriend. We're going to get married. That there must be some mistake here. So many times they'll direct the officer to contact the victim to verify their special relationship, which of course doesn't exist. And even after there's been restraining orders, even after they've been directed by the judge to cease contact, sometimes even after they've been in jail and are in jail, they continue to contact the victim. So sometimes they accrue additional stalking charges after the initial ones. So the case example, this is a man who actually doesn't have any prior mental health treatment, but family, friends, and his workplace really have noticed a change in his behavior over the past several years. He began to become very fixated that the country music industry was testing him to determine whether he could become a Grammy award-winning artist. So he became fixated on a particular country music star. He began stalking her, went to her house, approached her front door, was arrested. And while in jail, he continued to make contact with her. And he was diagnosed with delusional disorder or automatic type. Okay, so the next type is the deific decree. So this is an individual who either perceives command hallucinations from God or has delusional beliefs that God is directing them to do something. And again, they may also have delusions of reference, perceiving signs and symbols in their environment guiding their actions. I say deific decree, it can be God or a higher power, but sometimes individuals in this subtype also perceive directives that are evil. They perceive them as evil or from the devil. And if that's the case, oftentimes the command hallucinations are directives such that if the defendant does not comply with the command, then there's going to be greater consequences or harm. For example, the Deanna Laney case, or maybe even the Andrea Yates case would probably be good examples of this. The defendant may really wrestle with the commands and initially resist them, but eventually they perceive that they have to do this action, this crime, for the greater good or to fulfill some higher purpose. So ultimately they believe that what they're doing has a higher moral value. They may readily acknowledge behavior. Sometimes they even call 911 themselves. In this type, often there's a distinction between legal wrongfulness and moral wrongfulness. So acknowledging that they know the legal wrongfulness of their behavior, but indicating that they were following a higher power or greater cause. So for this subtype, in addition to not appreciating perhaps the moral wrongfulness of their actions, they may also not appreciate the nature of their actions depending on the details of the offense. So here's a case example. This person is charged with murder. He suffocated his 1-year-old daughter because God had been commanding him to sacrifice her by smothering her because she was perfect and innocent. He heard the Holy Spirit. He saw visions of Abraham and Isaac. His belief was that by sacrificing his daughter, he would bring about the second coming of Christ. So this was the greater good he felt he would be accomplishing. There was quite a lot of evidence of this man's psychotic symptoms and bizarre behaviors leading up to the crime. And in his case, he stated that while he knew what he did was wrong, he believed that following God's law trumped man's law. Okay, and then the disorganized type. This one is really characterized by disorganized behavior and disorganized thinking. This person is the kind of person who you don't need to be a psychologist or psychiatrist or mental health professional to recognize that there's something wrong. It's pretty obvious that they have significant psychotic symptoms. Their speech may be so disorganized, it may even be word salad or neologisms, or sometimes they even make up their own language. And they're often really quite impaired at the time of their arrest, such that they may be emergency committed to a psychiatric hospital. So in terms of the offense characteristics for the disorganized type, there's often no clear purpose, intent, or motive behind their behavior. It's senseless, it's purposeless. And many times the crimes that they're charged with are kind of public nuisance crimes. So they may be kind of wandering in and out of traffic or standing in the middle of the road, wandering in and out of stores, trespassing. And police are often called to do really like a welfare check on these individuals because it's quite obvious that something's not right. When the police arrive, it's very common in this type, and again, none of this is required, but it's common for them to be very combative, to really resist arrest. They don't have a good awareness of their surroundings, and so they're often very agitated. And these are the types of crimes that they may be charged with: disorderly conduct, blocking a passageway, public nuisance, things like this. Here's an example of the disorganized type. So this is a young woman who, despite her young age, has been psychiatrically hospitalized many times. She has not followed through with outpatient treatment, perceiving that any kind of psychiatric services are against her religion. She has had a number of prior misdemeanor arrests. And on this occasion, she's charged with disorderly conduct. So what was her behavior? She was found irrationally. And at least in my jurisdiction, if the police write the word irrational, you should probably pay strong attention to it because they don't easily write that word. She was irrationally walking around downtown. She was screaming, cursing, threatening pedestrians with a box cutter, kind of in a random, disorganized manner. And when officers arrived, she pulled down her pants, revealed her genitalia, spit on them, was kind of speaking gibberish, or what they thought maybe was a different language, but it turned out not to be a real language. And when she got admitted to the jail, she was very disinhibited and disorganized and was placed in seclusion immediately and then committed to a psychiatric hospital. So we thought she met criteria for the insanity defense based on not being able to appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions at the time due to her disorganized state. And I believe the last type that we're going to talk about is the false report. So these again are individuals who have persecutory delusions. As you can see in all these types, typically there are some psychotic symptoms present. Typically it is a baseline for kind of getting your foot in the door to the insanity defense. And they often perceive that either themselves or others are at risk of harm, or they may think that a crime has already been committed or is in the process of being committed. And so these defendants are often very desperate, very panicked, very desperate in their beliefs and very fearful. Sometimes when the police officers show up, they're screaming, they're running around, they're shaking, they're really very traumatized by their delusional beliefs, their perceptions of what they think is happening. And so what do they do? Well, they contact authorities, right? Because we're all taught that if there's an emergency and someone's being harmed or there's a crime happening, you should call 911. And so that's what they do. Typically, they don't just call 911 once. You know, you kind of get one free pass at 911, but if you call 100 times, then you're arrested. And at least in Tennessee, they're arrested and charged with something called false report, or sometimes it's harassment. And the reason they call so much is because the first few times they call, obviously nothing happens because it's not a real emergency. So they think, well, if I just keep calling, something eventually will happen. Sometimes they don't call. Sometimes they'll do something to alert authorities to the area or location. So they might pull like a fire alarm to bring authorities there, start a fire that would activate a fire alarm, or pull it themselves. And this is important. This subtype is different from the paranoid protection of self or paranoid protection of others, because they don't actually take action themselves to address the problem. Instead, they contact officials to handle it. So they're not directly addressing the threat, they're contacting officials to do it. Also, at the time of the crime, they often don't hide their beliefs. In fact, they want them to be known because they're desperately trying to get help for whatever they think is an emergency. So here's a case example. This is a man who has various medical and psychiatric conditions. He has a 20-year history of treatment for psychosis. He has prominent persecutory delusions, disorganized, pressured speech, delusional. And he kept calling 911 because he believed that he knew when the next terrorist attack was going to happen, because he thought he could foresee the future. And so he thought he had this really important knowledge that he had to communicate to the United States about an impending terrorist attack. So he just kept calling 911 to report this. And then he was eventually arrested. Okay, so those are the 7 types that were in the insanity defense typology. As I mentioned, there are other types. So there are some cases that don't fit into any type, that are a blend of multiple different subtypes. And so we call that a mixed type. There's also cases that don't fit into any. And then in our coding of our insanity defense cases, we found that sometimes there wasn't enough information in the report or in the available data to determine what type someone may or may not fit into. So we left not enough information as a possibility. Okay, so I want to switch gears and end with some research. So this research, as I mentioned, is going to, has been accepted for publication. It's not published yet, but it will be coming out in an upcoming issue of Behavioral Sciences and the Law. Myself and my colleague, Emmy Wood, are co-authors. And so if you look out for that, then you can hopefully see what the research is that we're starting to do in the sample. So this research, we looked at 187 court-ordered evaluations in which an insanity defense was supported. So for all of these defendants, we felt they met criteria for an insanity defense. This was over a 10-year period. The mean age in this sample was 41. It was mostly male, about 3/4 male, pretty evenly split between white and black defendants. Most were single, and pretty evenly split between evaluations in which the insanity defense was determined on an outpatient basis versus an inpatient basis during an inpatient forensic evaluation. So there were a range of evaluators. And what we did is we looked at the reports and the file information for these 167 cases, and we coded them. And so I have a coding scheme that I developed as a result of the insanity defense typology that was published in 2018. And that coding scheme will be published in the upcoming Behavioral Sciences and the Law paper. So by using the coding scheme, we tried to see how many of the insanity defense cases could we categorize. So there were 2 raters, and we had agreement in 82% of the cases that we were looking at. And in the remainder cases, we came to an agreement after discussion. So in this sample, almost everyone had a diagnosis with psychotic symptoms, 96%. 35% met criteria for schizophrenia, 10% delusional disorder, 43% had a diagnosis that had mixed psychotic and mood disorder symptoms. Of the charges, about half were charged with at least 1 violent felony, about 36% with a non-violent felony. And these are not mutually exclusive. They could be charged with more than 1 type. 16% charged with misdemeanors only. And there were no sexual offenses represented in our sample. Which is pretty consistent, I think, with the literature and my clinical experience, is that it's difficult to imagine a sex offense that might meet criteria for an insanity defense. 62% of this sample were their competency concerns, where the initial evaluator thought that they were likely incompetent and required inpatient treatment to become competent. So that is a very high number, but we do know from the literature that individuals who meet criteria for insanity defense have a higher initial base rate of incompetency. Ultimately, at the end of the day, about half of them were actually found not guilty by reason of insanity. What happened to the rest? Well, a third of the time their charges were dismissed and they never took an insanity defense. About 9% of the time they chose to plead guilty instead of taking an insanity defense. And in the remainder of the cases, we didn't have the disposition outcome. So what were the frequencies of these different subtypes? Did this actually pan out when we actually looked at the cases? Well, we could categorize 66% of the cases. So 123 cases were able to be coded into one of the existing 7 subtypes that I reviewed. So if you look at the breakdown, you will see clearly that of those 123 cases, a third of them met criteria for the paranoid protection of self type. So again, this is the most commonly represented subtype of all the subtypes. Paranoid protection of others, we found for 8% of those cases, but it's mine, 10%. And then the other types, the disorganized, the false report or automatic stalking, and day of decree, each of those were less than 4% of those 123 cases. 4% of the cases we felt met a mixed type, didn't fall into any one type squarely. 10% didn't meet any type. In other words, they were a different type of insanity defense that didn't fit the typology. And about a quarter of the cases, of the total cases, could not be coded into the one of the 7 subtypes because we just didn't have enough information. There wasn't enough detail in the reports to be able to determine the basis for the insanity opinion and therefore what subtype it might meet criteria for. This is just another way to present that data. You can see that the paranoid protection of self subtype is the largest piece of the pie there. And here's another way to present it. So you can see that the second most common data point is not having enough information, at least in our sample. There was a number of cases which we couldn't code because the information just wasn't available. So we looked at the characteristics of the subtypes. We wanted to see, were there any significant differences? Now that we coded the subtypes and we know what percentage of cases fall into each category or each subtype, were there any differences between these subtypes? Now, we only looked at the data for the 3 subtypes that had the most number of cases. So the paranoid self-defense, the paranoid protection of others, and the but it's mine. So that ended up being 99 cases that met one of those 3 subtypes. And what we found was not a lot, actually, that there really weren't many differences among these 3 subtypes. There were no differences in race, no differences in gender, no differences in marital status, and no differences in outcome. In other words, were they found in GRI? Were their cases dismissed? Did they plead guilty? No differences. So what did we find to be significant differences? Whether they had a primary psychotic disorder. Primary psychotic disorder means schizophrenia, delusional disorder, or an unspecified psychotic disorder. So not mixed with mood symptoms. The paranoid self-defense type were 4.3 times more likely to have a primary psychotic disorder than the but it's mine type. So you can see the percentage difference. 61% of the paranoid self-defense type had a primary psychotic disorder versus only 26% in the but it's mine type. There was a significant difference when we looked at violent offenses. So again, the paranoid self-defense type was 5.73 times more likely than the but it's mine type to be violent offense. And the paranoid protection of other was also 3.73 times more likely to be charged with a violent offense. And you can see the percentage breakdowns there. So there's differences in primary psychotic disorder, differences in violent offense, and there's differences in property crimes. So the but it's mine type were 7.16 times more likely to be charged with a property offense than the paranoid self-defense type, and 6.7 times more likely than the paranoid protection of others. So but it's mine, less likely to be violent, more likely to have property crimes, and more likely to have mixed symptoms with mood components compared to the 2 paranoid subtypes. Here are some other findings that are of clinical interest, but didn't reach significance. It was interesting that the highest percentage of females were in that paranoid self-defense type. I had mentioned that in our sample, the paranoid protection of others were actually all male. The paranoid self-defense had the most adjudications of NGRI, so they had 59% of this subtype were found in GRI, and fewer were found incompetent, suggesting that this may be a higher functioning, more organized subtype. The but it's mine subtype, as I mentioned, had more mood symptoms mixed with psychotic symptoms, consistent with the theory that these are individuals who have more grandiose delusions. Interestingly, there was kind of another branch of the but it's mine subtype where 16% had a neurocognitive disorder or a delirium as the primary diagnosis rather than a psychotic disorder. Fewer of this subtype were adjudicated in GRI. only 32%, and most of those charges ended up actually being dismissed. Some of the times this may be because they were incompetent, but there's probably other reasons as well. So just to review some limitations, this is not all inclusive. There certainly are other subtypes out there that exist. The other limitation that I really want to point out is that this is only based on data and information and experience from this jurisdiction. Now, I know that there are many other states that follow a modified McNaughton, but we really don't know yet how this will generalize to other jurisdictions. So there really needs to be more research and cross-validation. It would be good to see how this typology works using the coding scheme with other raters to see what the inter-rater agreement might be in other settings with other raters. And one of the research projects that we're working on now with my colleagues, Amanda Bidding and Emmy Wood, are what are the strongest indicators in each subtype. So looking at, of those different offense and defending characteristics for each subtype, which ones are most definitive for that particular subtype. How many do you have to have? So we're starting to do research on the paranoid protection of self subtype right now in coding cases. So in conclusions, the typology may be used to guide training. Maybe it will help improve consistency among raters and decrease bias. My goal in the typology is just to make it easier. Insanity defense evaluations are complicated, and I'm just trying to promote or trying to add some guide or structure to help us do these evaluations. The coding scheme, as I said, may provide structure. Paranoid protection of self is the most common. Some of the subtypes, as you saw in the research, were represented by very few cases, suggesting that there's potentially very few that would meet criteria. The only differences we saw among the three primary subtypes were the type of disorder and the type of charge. And as I said, more research is needed with additional sites and raters. So before we open up to questions, I just want to list my contact information there. You feel free to reach out to me. I know that we are going to be sending out the slides, so you will be able to get a copy of that from UNM. And then here are some references. So the first reference is the paper that I said was already published. The second is the manuscript that has been accepted. And then I also included this last article that I believe I had mentioned in the talk. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to questions.
Do you see down at the Q&A, looks like we've got 14. That's what you'll click on, and then you can just go through it however you'd like.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, so someone asked if the article can be included with the slides. I do not have any problem with that, but I'll leave that to Dr. Brovko to address.
Yeah, no problem. If you want to send it over to us, then I'd be happy to send it out, or Rachel can send it out to everybody.
Okay. Someone said that they were aware of individuals who have written in reports or testified in court that since the defendant ran from the crime scene, he must have known that the conduct was wrong. Yes, I see this too. So I'm always concerned when evaluators rely too heavily on one piece of data. I would say running from the crime scene alone probably should never inform whether someone met criteria for an insanity defense or not. In other words, it's not defining enough and you have to look at other pieces of information. I think that there's certainly very good examples of insanity defense cases where they did run. And one of the reasons they ran is because they were paranoid and they thought people were going to harm them. They thought that law enforcement was going to harm them. And so they were trying to protect themselves. So I don't see it as being inconsistent. I know that's one of the things we look for. Did you run? But I would say that's not defining enough. You can run from the crime scene and still not appreciate the wrongfulness of your conduct. Let's see, somebody indicated that their experience with type 1 and 2, which is the paranoid protection of self and the paranoid protection of others, is that they often are inept in their efforts, crime, violence related to this. For example, assaulting someone with, oops, I just lost the question. Where'd it go? Assaulting someone with a toothbrush in a drugstore and knocking them down. Yeah, I would agree. If you assault someone with a toothbrush, that's probably not a good strategy. For type 2, often grandiose, are they saving the world from destruction? I would say they're protecting the world. Maybe destruction, like if they think that they're taking out terrorists who are trying to destroy our country, then maybe I could see, yes, how they are trying to save the world from destruction. But there is the savior hero quality to the paranoid protection of others. So thanks for bringing that up. Is the typology more relevant to treatment or evaluation? It's a very interesting question. So it was designed, I designed it for the purpose of evaluation. I designed it to help people doing insanity defense evaluations. Could it guide treatment of NGRIs in the hospital? Possibly, that's not something I've thought of. Also, if a person is aware of the legal wrongfulness, but not moral wrongfulness of that person meet insanity criteria, in your opinion? Well, that's a loaded question. It depends on what state you're in. So in Tennessee, our case law does not distinguish between legal and moral wrongfulness. In other words, you don't have to have a specified one to meet the insanity defense criteria, whereas other states do specify. Some states say you have to not appreciate the legal wrongfulness. So you'll have to look at the jurisdiction that you practice in. Most cases that I see are impaired in their moral wrongfulness, if I had to break it down. Please address the etiology and curative measures employed regarding the psychotic disorders. How do you differentiate a delusional disorder from schizophrenia when the symptomatology in either is so bizarre? Yeah, so for the insanity defense typology, the diagnosis, the specific psychotic disorder diagnosis is less important than the symptoms that were occurring at the time of the crime. How do you distinguish between schizophrenia and delusional disorder? Well, the great thing about DSM-5 is that you no longer, they remove the requirement that the delusions be non-bizarre from delusional disorder. So if you have someone with prominent delusions, even if they're bizarre, they can meet criteria for delusional disorder so long as they don't have the other symptoms of schizophrenia, like the prominent disorganization and prominent hallucinations. But for the typology, I think at the symptom level is going to be more important than the actual diagnosis, although I know that we do make diagnoses as well. Have you found that presenting this information, the typology in court or reports, increases the ability of the trier of fact to understand the opinion you are offering? How has this been received on cross-examination? Great questions. You know, I haven't really been cross-examined in the typology yet. My day's coming, I'm sure, and that'll be fun. But most of the time I testify in competency to stand trial cases. I will tell you that I have provided this, the 2018 article to attorneys in insanity defense cases, and generally it's been well received. And at least in my jurisdiction, most of the insanity defense cases are stipulated to. We don't have trials except for the really serious crimes. So the cross-examination has not happened yet. I will caution though that if you, I hope you're not, but if you are cross-examined on the typology for some reason, if someone gets a hold of it, I would just be really cautious to remind them that the typology is not all-inclusive or comprehensive. And just because, for example, you're offering support on an insanity defense that doesn't meet the typology doesn't mean anything. There's more out there. What percentage of successful insanity defenses does this number represent? Oh, okay, good question. So in our jurisdiction, of the cases that are referred to us for the court-ordered evaluation, our base rate is about 10%. About 10% of the cases referred to us do we find meet criteria for the insanity defense. So that's not too far off from the base rate in Virginia, the 16%, 16.9% that they found. And of those, remember that only about half of our sample actually ended up taking being found not guilty by reason of insanity. Okay, someone asked about the cases in which there was not enough information. Was there primary identifiable information missing? Yes, yes. So this came up mostly with the reports from the inpatient hospital. Those reports tended to be shorter in length with less detail. And so we simply couldn't tell the basis and opinion and supporting data for the insanity defense. So with enough information, I would hope that you could code more cases.
I'm going to interrupt real quick. Just everybody, we are officially done with the talk today. We're going to stay on and answer more of your questions, but the talk is officially over. So for those of you that need to run to something else, you're welcome to do so now.
Okay. A few more questions here. In your coding scheme, do you identify and code subcomponents? Yes, we do. So the coding scheme is broken down for each subtype into defendant characteristics and offense characteristics. And we are starting to code those specific subcomponents for the paranoid protection of self type, since that's the most common. So that is a research project that is on the way, and that is part of the coding scheme. Is there any research on risk of re-offending among subtypes? No, there's not. That's a fascinating question. Now, I think the typology is probably pretty new for that line of research, but I think that that is a really interesting direction to go in. It's a very good question. Someone wants me to go back to the contact information. Okay, we'll do that in a second. And do I have any brief recommendations for using this in training future forensic evaluators? Well, thank you for that question. I'm really excited that this could be used in training for future forensic evaluators. I know that in the state of Tennessee, they have begun to introduce this in the training for the state evaluators. You could reference the paper, which does have case examples in it, the 2018 paper. The coding scheme may be a little bit too detailed for the purpose of training, so I'd probably start with the paper, and you could always just talk about the 3 main subtypes. Okay, I think I have addressed all the questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah, this was really good. For those of you that are still on, we'll be on for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Go ahead and get your surveys. But otherwise, Dr. Brown, thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, Julie. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week. Bye.